From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Is the political right making a comeback in Europe or not? Spain goes to the polls and the center-right Popular Party gains seats, but not enough to form a new government. We'll tell you what happened and why it matters. Also, a big week coming for economic news in the United States, with the Federal Open Market Committee meeting this week to decide whether to raise interest rates again or continue the pause that it started in June. Also, second quarter GDP report comes out Thursday. Will tell us something about the pace of economic growth and whether the economy is on a path to that fabled soft landing of lore or is more trouble ahead. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And here on Potomac Watch, I'm joined by Joseph Sternberg. Joe is based in London for us. Welcome, Joe. How are you?
Hey, Paul. I am well. How are you?
Not so bad. You took a reporting trip to Spain not too long ago as kind of size up where the election was. So I just want to relate your credentials here to our listeners about your credibility in Spain. And you wrote about it, and you were expecting, I think it's fair to say, that the Popular Party, the center-right party, would do pretty well in this snap election that was called by the ruling Socialists after some regional voting defeats. The PP did, in fact, gain 38% of seats in the election on Sunday, and that was the leading party of the big four, but the Socialists got 34%. But the PP was denied an outright majority in terms of working with a coalition. They had hoped to be able to form a center-right majority, and that fell short. What happened?
Well, I think a bunch of things happened. I think, first off, we should understand that the big story here is that the Popular Party has, performed much better than they did 4 years ago. So I think that it's important to keep in mind that, although as with any election, winning is ultimately the important thing, they have definitely made big steps in that direction in this election compared to where they started it 4 years ago. I mean, sort of increasing their seat count in the parliament significantly. I think that they did run into problems related to the other party on the right, which is further to the right of the Popular Party, which is a group called Vox, which had engaged in a very intensive culture war campaign on a lot of issues to do with gender, national identity, that sort of thing, and also is part of this broader European development of some of these parties of the far right, which I do think still make a lot of centrist voters nervous.
Yeah, Sanchez, the socialist prime minister, really just waved that bloody flag of Francisco Franco, the dictator from 50, almost 50 years ago when Franco died. And he was comparing Vox to bringing back the dictatorship.
Yes, and I think that did work to an extent, because certainly it seems to have rallied some of those centrist voters in Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's own Socialist Party, whom some pollsters I spoke to had thought were actually in danger of peeling to the right to the Popular Party because those socialist voters were unhappy with Sanchez. So I think that a certain amount of this red flag waving about Vox on the far right succeeded politically for the left here. But remember, this was not actually a good result for the left either. I mean, they have lost votes between Pedro Sanchez's socialists and then the further left sort of group of parties called Sumar. They have lost ground compared to where they were 4 years ago. And I think that this sets up a really interesting dynamic because Vox also lost ground in this election compared to 4 years ago. They've lost nearly 20 seats compared to their 2019 result. And does that mean that now voters might think that they are less of a threat the next time there's an election, and will that end up helping the Popular Party?
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, I remember meeting with a variety of representatives from Vox before the pandemic. They came through and saw us. I mean, they certainly didn't sound or look, sound at all like fascists. I mean, that's just over-the-top criticism of them. Yeah, they're culturally conservative, but there's a deep strain in Spanish society of that. And I think they were pushing back against some of the progressive cultural forays by Sanchez, and particularly his lack of firmness in opposing some of the regional separatists, particularly in Catalonia.
Yeah, I mean, Europe loves having freakouts about these parties on the far right. I mean, in Spain, you have Vox. In Italy, you've had various movements like the Northern League, or now the Brothers of Italy of Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. In France, you have what used to be what's now called the National Rally. In Germany, you have the Alternative for Germany. And I think that there's a tendency to not understand that all of these parties are actually very different from each other. And so I think that whereas some of these parties in other parts of Europe take a very anti-immigration tone, a very anti-European Union tone, can have some off-putting elements to them, even for people who are on the political right like us. Vox is a different animal. I think it's much more motivated by national unity issues that are very alive within Spain, where there's a constant dilemma about regional separatism in Catalonia and other areas. And they're kind of motivated by the sense of cultural conservatism that you would expect in a still majority Catholic country. And even then, I mean, it wasn't clear that voters always really endorsed some of the furthest right elements of that. And there's a sense in which Vox's rise was an attempt by old Popular Party voters to try to pull the Popular Party more into being a mainstream center-right party instead of drifting further leftward.
Yeah, that's, I think, part of the issue. And this election pulled away some voters from Vox because it did take a harder line on migrants and migration from Africa and the Middle East. So that helped the PP. This point you make about the freakout in Europe, but also in the United States, every time some kind of conservative party in Europe does well, the same story. It's fascism is just around the corner. Turns out that it's always overstated. Now, it wasn't for a time in the last century, but we saw it in Italy with the Prime Minister Meloni, who is very much a conservative leader, coalition leader. But, she is in office, seemed to be pretty sensible, including on Ukraine, which Italy is, there's a strain of pro-Russian sentiment in Italy.
I mean, there's a fascinating push and pull that goes on with a lot of these parties in Europe, which I think so many people miss, because certainly the rise of these parties is partly an attempt by a conservative portion of the electorate, but also some disaffected voters from the political left to try to pull the political system back closer to where those voters are on issues like immigration or economic policy or cultural issues, family policies, that sort of thing. These parties also go through a learning process themselves once they get close to political power, where they discover that actually their voter base is only part of a much bigger electorate. And if you want to be successful as a politician, you have to take account of where the majority of the voters are and not just your own party's supporters. And that's why, for example, Giorgia Meloni in Italy is not staging a rebellion against the European Union or trying to pull Italy out of the euro. It's because membership in the euro currency is actually a mainstream position in Italy. And so I think that people need to take a step back and understand that although the rise of these parties can signal that there's a lot of discontent with the existing politics in many parts of Europe, and for very good reason, these parties also are operating within democratic systems, and you have to have a little more faith in the ability of democracy and the ruthless discipline of elections to exert a certain gravitational pull on these parties the closer they actually get to power.
So what's going to happen in Spain? I guess, is Sanchez, the current prime minister, going to get a chance first to form a coalition government, or will it default to the PP?
Well, the Popular Party was the biggest vote getter of any of them at about 136 seats compared to 122 for Sanchez's Socialists. So the Popular Party and their leader, Alberto Feijóo, will get the first crack, although I think they're going to find it impossible to form a coalition that can get them over the 50% mark. You need 176 seats for a majority in the lower house. And then the Socialists might get a crack under Mr. Sanchez, and presumably they can cobble together a minority government between the Socialists and this far-left Sumar movement and some of these regional separatist parties. But that's very politically dangerous for Sanchez, because that separatism is what motivates the conservatives. So the other option is what they did in 2019, which is if you go several months after the first election without a conclusive result, you end up having a second election a few months down the road and see if voters have changed their mind as they've seen some of the politicking between the two votes.
Okay, so there could very well be another election coming up here in the short term if nobody can form a solid, stable new government.